Greetings, everyone. Happy Data Privacy Day. I'm Denise Stolzall, UCSC's Privacy Officer, and along with my privacy colleagues, really pleased to host tonight's panel discussion of the award-winning documentary Coded Bias. Before we get started with tonight's program, I'd like to read the land acknowledgement used at UC Santa Cruz that was developed in partnership with the Ama Mutsun Tribal Band Chairman and the Ama Mutsun Relearning Program at the UCSC Arboretum. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awawa-speaking UP tribe. The Ama Mutsun Tribal Band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historic trauma. The Privacy Office is pleased to welcome distinguished professors to discuss the award-winning documentary Coded Bias that explores how machine learning algorithms can perpetuate society's existing class, race, and gender-based inequities. While working on an assignment involving facial recognition software, the MIT Media Lab researcher Joy Buolamwini found that the algorithm couldn't detect her face until she put on a white mask. As she recounts in the documentary, Buolamwini soon discovered that most such artificial intelligence programs are trained to identify patterns based on data sets that skew light-skinned and male. As she says, when you think of AI, it's forward thinking, but AI is based on data, and data is a reflection of our history. Coded Bias tackles its sprawling subject by zeroing in empathetically on the human costs and examines algorithmic bias as a modern civil rights issue, and sheds light on privacy and equity issues related to increasing reliance on artificial intelligence. I trust you all that were able to watch the film before tonight, but in case you haven't, I still think it should be available to view until midnight. None of this would have been possible without the truly dedicated work behind the scenes of UCSC's Privacy Office and Events Office staff. Thank you guys so much. It is with much gratitude also that we recognize that much of the funding for tonight's program is from UCSC's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Thank you. We ask that the audience please submit questions into the Q&A section, and they'll be incorporated into the discussion as we can. And also tonight's program is being recorded. The Privacy Office is pleased to welcome distinguished UCSC professors Neda Atanasoski, and she's the professor and chair of feminist studies and professor and former director of critical race and ethnic studies at UC Santa Cruz. She's the author of Humanitarian Violence, the U.S. Deployment of Diversity and Surrogate Humanity, Race, Robots, and the Politics of Technological Futures, co-authored with Kalindi Vora. Neda is also the co-editor of 2017 special issue of the journal Social Identities, titled Post-Socialist Politics and the Ends of Revolutions. Atanasoski has published articles on gender and religion, nationalism and war, human rights and humanitarianism, and race and technology, which have appeared in journals such as American Quarterly, Cinema Journal, Catalyst, and the European Journal of Cultural Studies. And Atanasoski is currently the co-editor of the journal Critical Ethnic Studies and the founding co-director of the Center for Racial Justice at UC Santa Cruz. Welcome, Neda. So Darke is our next panelist, and she's an artist and game maker designing radical tools for social intervention. Still in the class war, now in the pandemic. She's in the combination class war and pandemic. Assistant Professor of Digital Arts and New Media and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at UC Santa Cruz, Darke also directs The Other Lab, an interdisciplinary intersectional feminist research space for experimental games and new media. She's currently working on Yay or Nay, a Kanye West themed game about Black culture and the open source Afro Hair Library, a 3D modeled database for Black hairstyles and textures. Her interests are subversive art and games, intersectionality, maximizing agency for marginalized bodies, experimental VR, gamifications of empathy, everyday impact, and ethical trolling. Our moderator tonight is Jody Green, Associate Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning and Professor of Literature at UC Santa Cruz. She's also the founding director of UCSC's Center for Innovations in Teaching and Learning. In addition to educational and organizational development in higher education, Green's research interests include intellectual property, human rights, and the history of the institution of literature. A new volume, Human Rights After Corporate Personhood, co-edited with Sharif Youssef, has been published by the University of Toronto Press. Green has published articles in journals such as PMLA, Critical Inquiry, and GLQ. Her most recent writing has appeared in Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle of Higher Education. So we welcome our panelists, and without further ado, we'll hand it over to our moderator, Jody Green.
Thanks so much, Denise, and thank you to everyone from the Privacy Office and also from University Relations for putting this event together. And I want to welcome you all this evening to this discussion of coded bias. I'm so excited to hear from my brilliant colleagues, Neda and AM, as we take a look at this film. Its critical approach to the question of algorithms and surveillance, and also, where the film itself may have some blind spots. So welcome, and we will start with a question. Right off the bat, the film starts off by discussing the failure of facial recognition technology to be able to recognize Black faces, and especially Black women's faces. Is the solution then to train the facial recognition systems to be more accurate in recognizing Black and brown faces?
Briefly, no.
Next question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a big question, because I think, so much of my work is dealing with this idea of representation. And, we've seen in the last few years, sort of like hashtag representation matters. And, like we need to become more visible. We need to look at historically oppressed people, make sure that they're included. But then, included in what and for what purposes, to what end. And so I think that for the purposes of Joy's work, where she wanted to make this, she wanted to use this algorithm for her own personal mirror, right? Like I believe it was kind of like a hype mirror. That makes total sense, where, she can use this technology. It's only for her. It's not being collected. She's not being surveilled, by the state or by a corporation. And so I understand wanting to be included in that. But when we think about how these algorithms are used more broadly and nefariously, I don't know that I want, for example, the police to be better at looking at my face. And I know that that means that there are going to be more sort of false positives, and that might lead to more harassment. But I also think that that makes me feel like I don't know that I want them to be more accurate in surveilling me. I think that's the wrong sort of question. I think that I don't want anyone to be surveilled, and I want to push back against that sort of widespread state surveillance. Yeah.
And corporate surveillance as well, I suspect. Neda, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's interesting, this question of whether, how the film approaches this question of whether the solution is better, more accurate facial recognition that can recognize Black faces and Black women's faces. And, there's that moment where Joy goes to IBM, right? And then the sort of the greater data set increases the accuracy of the facial recognition software. But I think the film does also think about this question as of technology and difference in representation as a contradiction, because there's also the really powerful moment in the film with the tenants that are organizing against facial recognition software. And they make the really important point that there's a kind of idea that it is the wealthy or the privileged who get technology first, whereas in fact, technologies are often first experimented on in poor communities, communities of people of color, et cetera. I mean, we can think about the longer history of this kind of experimentation, like with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So I was really interested in how the tenants were able to sort of push back on that discourse of kind of inclusion into technological modernity. And I think that sometimes just inclusivity or representation can be such an impoverished way to think about technology. The example I often use is this chatbot Bina48, which is a kind of like a torso chatbot, and it's a chatbot that's a Black woman. And this Stony Brook professor, Stephanie Dinkins, who is also Black, becomes really interested in Bina48. And there's a series of videos where she's talking to Bina48, who is able to respond back and is connected to the internet and has cameras, et cetera. And Stephanie Dinkins asked Bina48 if she's experienced racism, and the chatbot answers, "No, I didn't have it." Right. And so here is this kind of really limited representation. It's an anthropomorphic robot who looks like a Black woman, and it gets celebrated in the media as diversifying tech, but can't speak to racism. Right. And so what kind of inclusion into what kind of representation is the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent point. And then that goes back to, for me, right, it's like there are certain structures that I want to be represented, right? And so it's not even about like, should we make algorithms, the problem isn't we should make algorithms more accurate, but accurate for what purpose? Once again, like who, if you can recognize my face, then who is able to collect and own that data, and what can they do with it? So of course I want technology to work for me, but I want it to work for me, not work on me, if that makes sense, and certainly not work against me. And so I think that we have to get into that question, right, of like who owns access to the image, to the body, and what are the material impacts of that?
Yeah, that's great. And it brings us to our next question, but also what you said about representation, it really made me think about how much critical mileage we've gotten out of overlaying the different meanings of representation over each other. And yet you're pointing out that like at this point, we might actually need to separate it out into different words, right? Because some kinds of representation are so much more harmful than others. So the next question, we might think that there's a set of questions here about state rights and political surveillance, and a set about corporate surveillance and corporate rights. But actually this next question really gets at something that I'm particularly interested in, which is that those two questions may not be so different after all. So how can we think about data in relation to our rights as civil rights, as human rights, and how do the rights of corporations within US capitalism and within US political life reflect the current situation around data and rights? Or how do they almost sort of allow us to see the current situation around data and rights with greater clarity? What is the role of legislation, and what other kinds of actions could we imagine in relations to the ways that algorithms are biased and that algorithms are used? There's actually about 4 questions in there.
This Zoom format is so, I'm like, I don't want to talk over anyone. You don't get the feedback. It's so odd. Neda and I have been talking about this, and I think what I really came away with, based on some research that I was doing, and then I saw the film when I was also at the same time reading Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction, and I just came away thinking, oh my God, this idea that comes up in games and internet culture about like how toxic it can be, and the sort of like speculation of why that is and how people act in these digital spaces. This term corporeality keeps coming up, where it's like people don't recognize the body. They don't recognize that there's a body on the other end of the screen. All of it feels abstract, or it feels like an avatar. And I bring that up in games because I saw such resonance in that space. And then in the space in terms of like data rights, because we do not, both individually, but I'll get to that. I don't think it should be an individual solution, but I think conceptually, we don't think about our data as an extension of our bodies. And it really, truly is the ways that it's used, the way that it impacts us, the way that it informs our material conditions and our agency. And, I bring up the example that, when I go to the doctor and, the doctor wants to recommend like an invasive procedure, whatever that's for, whether that's just a checkup or maybe it's a life-saving sort of intervention. I am like there's this concept of informed consent. I'm told what the risks are, I'm told what the benefits are, and I'm allowed to opt out. Like there's a deep respect for and understanding and acknowledgement of my sort of like bodily autonomy. And there is legislation around what you can share, right? My therapist can't go post my therapy sessions on Twitter. My doctor, if my doctor wants to share something that's going on around my care, they have to, we get these pages of documents. They also have to sort of like, there has to be a justification. And not saying that that system itself isn't flawed or works perfectly, but there's an acknowledgement that, the body should be protected. Again, if somebody were to, were to assault me, right? Like there's an understanding that like, it's not okay to, manipulate or harm another person's like physical being in a way that we don't acknowledge for our data. And I think this became really poignant for me when I was doing research. I wanted to do a facial recognition piece, and I was looking at what kinds of facial recognition data sets, training sets. So like, but basically what images can I use that are most freely accessible in order for me to create my training set for this algorithm I wanted to create. And when I looked into it, like the most accessible images were from pre-conviction photos, so mugshots. And we know that, if we're thinking about who's like criminalized, like, okay, that is going to be lots of like poor Black and brown people. And I thought it was really strange that, thinking about ownership and ownership of bodies, I'm drawing a line between, slavery to incarceration to now, let's say you are criminalized and part of the system. You may not ever be incarcerated, right? You may not be ever convicted. You may not be found guilty, but yet your body is still within this system that can be freely distributed, that's in the public record and can be used and manipulated however, to whatever end. And in talking to another artist, Mcdonald, who was doing similar work around this and was exploring like, what are the fates of these people? Who are these people, right? Some of those people, have like passed away, like aren't even there to like they can't opt out. They can't sort of write in and say, take me out of the system. Their family can't say, actually, we want, our family member's body to be removed from the system. There's no sort of return, right? Like, and so I'm thinking about slave narratives. I'm thinking about zombies. I'm thinking about the fact that once again, you're bought and sold. Your body's bought and sold, but then your data is bought and sold once again, right? And like this to me is, yeah, it's. I'm sorry, I've gone like all over the place, but like this is what I think about when I think about how it is a human rights issue and a civil rights issue. Is that first we need to understand data as an extension of our bodies, and we need to treat it with the same kinds of protections, which are not individualist, right? That are systemic, and one way is legislature.
Neda, thoughts?
Yeah, in thinking about that question, I think it's interesting to consider, and AM and I were talking about this, how China is positioned in the movie, in relation to, I'm not necessarily going to say in contrast to, but in relation to the US and the UK. And so China almost serves as this sort of warning, this dystopian, authoritarian space where every aspect of everybody's lives is monitored, everybody's surveyed. And then there's the one young woman with, who speaks and talks about the convenience of it, and who talks about actually liking the social score and no longer needing to make a decision for herself about whether her potential friends are trustworthy or not. And I do think in that sense, China plays the same role in the film as it has in the West, in the US and, Western European imagination for a really long time, which is China as like a primary violator of human rights, as an authoritarian state, as everything that democracy isn't. And so I do think like in that sense, China functions as a warning. It's, similar to a recent BBC story I heard about a man in China breaking quarantine during the pandemic, and he got tied to a tree to be made an example of. And the story was, well, no wonder they can control the pandemic, we can't, right? Because we're not gonna tie someone to a tree. And so, but then I was thinking about the film makes the case that, China at least is transparent, whereas, and I think the film puts it, they talk about the West as having like a quiet, individualized model of social control. And I think it's really interesting sort of to how individualism plays into that, and how it works in relation to corporate authoritarianism then, in contrast to state authoritarianism, right? Because there is still this pretense of convenience and individualism, but it's sold in the form of choice, right? Like choice at your fingertips, choice about what's in your news feed. Everything is kind of an individual choice. But I think, if we pay attention to corporate authoritarianism, we get to a really different place. Like in 2018, there was this news story, they made a huge splash about an Amazon patent for wristbands for workers in the warehouse. And, if the worker moved in the wrong direction or was going to do something that was not efficient, the wristband was going to buzz and, and give a warning. And so I wonder how we can think about the increasingly authoritarian nature of work in capitalist societies, and how what kind of legislation is gonna address that, right? Because we end on this hopeful note with cities passing legislation to ban facial recognition technology, but there's this whole sort of side of corporate authoritarianism that I think could be thought about more. And I don't know, Jody, I'm wondering what you think about this question from the perspective of like corporations as entities with rights. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been thinking as you were talking about this term efficiency, particularly, and what happens if we think of efficiency as corporate authoritarianism, not only with the wristbands, but actually a kind of really subtle form of corporate authoritarianism. I don't know if anyone heard on Fresh Air yesterday, there was someone talking about a book on this exact same topic about the use of surveillance software. And one of the examples that he used was, getting on a plane and using a facial scan to get on a plane. Or just, I happen to have gotten a new phone recently. And of course, the very first thing I was asked was, would you like to use facial recognition software to open your phone? And I just think that it's true that it was the Chinese woman in the film who got me thinking, to what extent is efficiency its own form of really successful corporate authoritarianism that we all kind of sign on to, and that is often coded in the conversations that you hear, more casual conversations, as it's my right to decide that it's more efficient for me to open my phone with my face than with a passcode. So yeah, I think that's really where it comes in for me. As always, the notion of rights kind of trumping any notion of what my responsibilities or collective responsibilities might be for participating in those structures that I know full well are used for other populations, not mine, in these coercive and oppressive ways. So.
I mean, I like that you talk about how it's coercive. I was also thinking about, right, how ubiquitous these systems are. And I think a natural response is to kind of feel a sense of like individual responsibility, like, oh, well, I should just get off of Facebook, or I should just unplug. And I think that at this point, this really is, and this is only going to escalate in the future, especially now that we're in the pandemic and everything's digital, but I don't think you really can opt out. Even if you just think about the networks that you're a part of, I had a friend who did an art piece where they were trying to actually get off of Facebook, but because Facebook can sort of triangulate, like if Jody's there and Neda's there, well, and they can kind of basically draw a silhouette of where I'm at, even if I'm not there. So you really can't opt out. This, I think, also thinking about, we've seen these cases where people are going to ancestry.com and then, they're just curious about their history. And then like a distant cousin somewhere that they didn't know about now is, convicted. And, like that, you're not, it's not sort of something that you can control individually, but also socially. I'm thinking 7 years ago when I moved to, or maybe it was 10 years ago, I'm getting old, but like I moved to San Francisco, and, I was looking, I'd never been there, and I was looking for a room, and it was really difficult to become a roommate, because the first thing was, what's your social media? And at that time, I didn't have really social media. I didn't have a social media presence. And so it was like, oh, well, you're not cool. But now fast forward 10 years later, if you're going through customs and, you're suspicious, and we know like how that's racialized, right? If you don't have social media, you're suspicious. Well, you must have deleted something. Or if you're applying for a job and you don't have an Instagram account or social media account, it's like, well, what are you hiding? And like all of this actually, we can talk about choice, but it does feel mandatory. And in some cases, like that idea that we're responsible for our privacy, again, right? Privacy Awareness Day, like as if there's a thing that we can do. Actually, as we were talking about like, the idea of like who owns data and like who is property and things like that. We also have to talk about who is afforded privacy, right? Before the pandemic, if you had your face covered, that was a bad and suspicious thing, right? Like, and now it's like, great, mask up, great. One of the benefits of like, folks wearing masks, these uprisings across the nation is like, okay, well, that's going to trick the facial recognition. And of course, now they're developing like how to recognize your face without around a mask. But again, like that idea of privacy being individual, like it's just not afforded to everyone.
Absolutely. And the kind of paralysis of the question, should I agree to the contact tracing on my phone? I mean, I don't think I've ever paused longer over anything. Is it a civic good for me to participate in contact tracing? Is it deeply problematic for me to participate in contact tracing? So I agree with you. I think the question of what's and I'm not on Facebook, but the question of what's elective and what's not elective. I was doing a mentoring meeting with someone that I'm working with in India through a non-academic program. And at the very end of my first call with her, this young gender activist in India said, could I get your WhatsApp number? And I said, I'm not on WhatsApp. And what happened to her face when I said I'm not on WhatsApp was just so arresting. It was unimaginable to her that someone, who's an academic and involved in any kind of politics would not be on WhatsApp. So I don't know. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Neda, or should we go on to I guess our next question is related. How can we talk about the relationship with data and property? Who owns one's data is, our next kind of touch-in point. Is there even such a thing as data? Like, I think, do I ever own my data would be a question. Like, isn't it data sort of always already alienated from me and not my property?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that AM was speaking about it earlier in terms of thinking about the way that data is commodified is really interesting. And I was thinking about some other kind of pre-histories of this and in relation to the extraction of data from people that then becomes owned by a corporation. And the example that most directly came to mind were the HeLa cells, the immortal cell line that derived from cervical cancer cells of a Henrietta Lacks, who was a Black woman, and without her consent, and basically that today underlies this sort of multi-billion-dollar biotech industry, right? So there's other ways that we can think about these histories of how data is extracted and also how it functions in a way that is racialized. So I think, as AM pointed out, we live in the US, which was a country that was founded on the idea that some people are property, right? And that is sort of the foundation of this capitalism and this democracy, right? From which we then ask for certain rights. And I think that history determines sort of who is, for example, for the first time fearing that they're becoming property through their data extraction, who has the privilege to ask the question, like, what am I consenting to? What am I giving up? This is my ownership. Like I own myself, right? Versus people who are always subject to surveillance, classification, et cetera. So I think that question around data and property should always be addressed as a racial question that is about how capitalism works in the US.
Yeah, I was also just wondering if I've been thinking about this issue of because some of the proposed solutions, right, or thoughts around what's going on with data or how data is used is about transparency, right? Like that's part of what makes it harmful. It's not transparent. But I also think that a lot of the focus is transparency about like, basically the subjects of data collection. And I'll just tell a brief story about, so I'm currently doing a residency with the Open Data Institute, and they had a brief where they wanted to have artists come and make work to present. The audience was actually data practitioners for their conference. So folks who are already technologically savvy, who are building these structures. And they wanted to use, to have artists sort of challenge this idea of like, think about what you're doing. What can you do to build these systems in an ethical way? Like, can we reveal like the material harm that's being caused to communities, either by the data that's collected or the data that's not collected? Because that can also be a problem. Like, again, thinking back to representation, well, we know that for, decades historically, white men were basically the basis of study for medical study. And so everybody else was just sort of, well, you're less human, but we'll see how these like results apply to you. And so that's definitely, can be harmful. And I'm not against, all forms of data collection, but to that end, I wanted to build an algorithm that was for me. I thought, instead of predictive policing or these other things, what algorithm would be useful to me in my life? And for me, it would be really helpful if I knew who in a meeting was going to microaggress me or mansplain to me, or who was a Karen who might call the police on me if I was in the wrong neighborhood or not dressed a certain way. And I was like, that's great. Like, why should, like a bunch of dudes like, make these decisions that impact our lives? Why not just me? Why not just one belligerent Black femme? Like, I should be able to control this and develop my own social scores. And, the ODI loved this concept, but what they didn't love, and they're very supportive, the ODI has been wonderful to work with, but their legal counsel basically said that the work that I wanted to present posed too many challenges, then could bankrupt essentially the ODI, and here's why. So instead of focusing so often as we do, focus on the impact of marginalized people, and sometimes at least artists can make work that, at least I try to avoid serving sort of a marginalized experience like on a platter for a privileged audience, to say, once again, let me shine a light on how like Black and brown and queer communities and poor communities are, impacted negatively. And we all get to feel sad about that for 5 minutes, right? I'm increasingly trying to focus on the architects of these harmful systems. And so I said, I want to make this algorithm and I want to base it. I want to apply my own subjective, interpretations, but I want to build the set out of LinkedIn data from people who explicitly advertise, because that's what LinkedIn is. It's a place where you are selling yourself because you want to get opportunities, right? Like that's what that does, which I think should be fair game. But I wanted to look for folks who were, liaisons with ICE that worked, at Twitter, or folks who were working with Microsoft building these, algorithms. And I was specifically wanting to look for the sort of everyday person to really reveal that it's not just these like, high figures that we're used to like focusing on, that it is like we're complicit when we build these systems. And I thought, this is fair game because these folks are advertising that this is what they do. And, the proposal wasn't approved, not because the concept wasn't strong, but because the class of people who are building these systems are protected because they're thought of as like, well, there's too much risk, and sort of highlighting what they're doing. And so when I think about transparency, it is really not surprising, but dispiriting to know that all of us users, right, who are signing into these systems, whether it's Facebook or whether we're unable to actually consent and our information is just considered public record. Our information is freely accessible, freely owned, freely transferred, by the way, owned by so many entities. I don't get a notification when Facebook said, I'm off Facebook, but hypothetically, I don't get a notification when Instagram or Twitter sells my data to someone else or transfers it or gives other access. And yet all of that is being traded so freely and not transparently, but like we cannot reveal who's creating these structures. And so I think even if we were to try to, there could be more transparency in how our information is being used, but I actually want transparency in who's building the systems. I want to see, like, where's your name attached to this? Where's your image? Like, how do I hold someone accountable if that part of the process is not transparent?
So that raises a really interesting question about privacy, which is, what about the privacy of the producers of these systems? I think is really the question that you're posing, is whenever we talk about data privacy, we tend to talk about the privacy of the subjects of these systems. But what if we had more transparency around that question? That's a really great insight. Neda, anything to add? Okay. So moving to the present moment, and for those of you who have posed questions, thank you so much. And we're going to shift to your questions in just a few minutes. But we had a few more bases to hit in our preparation. So in what way has the pandemic either changed or accelerated some of the issues in the documentary? And we've talked a little bit about health systems in general, but what about racialized health systems in particular?
If I am thinking about the pandemic, I haven't really been thinking about it in terms of racialized health systems, although of course I think that's really important. But I have been thinking about how the pandemic has. We were talking earlier about how some parts of the US population have always been surveyed, have never had a right to privacy. And when I think about the pandemic, I'm thinking about how those who have been privileged have been forced to think about ways in which they engage with certain kinds of platforms all of a sudden in different ways, because now these technologies are in the homes of those who are privileged enough not to have to work outside of the home. And I'm thinking about Naomi Klein's writing on the pandemic shock doctrine. And she's trying to get people to think about how in this future where, that is now with the pandemic, where privileged people get everything delivered to their door with apps, et cetera, delivered by people who have to essentially like risk their lives. How in fact this future is one that is actually about consolidating a particular kind of wealth for corporations. But I think that, and she makes the point that in an earlier moment, these same technologies were sold to people in the name of convenience and personalization, and so I find it interesting how for the first time that a lot, so much depends on technology, people's jobs, et cetera, remote work, that kind of thing has raised this issue around privacy and data in ways that people might not have necessarily thought about it before. But, I think that something that AM and I were talking about earlier is, for those of us at Santa Cruz, these issues were actually raised even before the pandemic last year, right? Like with the strike. I'm thinking about certain platforms that our own, university uses, like Zoom and Canvas, right? With Canvas, the issue was raised, like who owns that data that's on Canvas? Is it the university, or, and the platform was used to like monitor which graduate student workers didn't submit their grades, right? And so I think that there's particular moments that really bring those issues around like privacy and data to the forefront in particular kinds of ways. And so that's how I think about the pandemic, that it's like one moment that kind of forced a certain sort of broader conversation around, the platforms and the technologies that we use.
Yeah, I mean, of course, if we extend the conversation around the pandemic to pandemic teaching, we could have a big conversation about surveillance proctoring as well as the LMS. And so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I agree with you. Am, I saw that you unmuted for this question.
Yeah, because it actually made me reflect on experience that I've been having in the last couple of weeks. So I hadn't been thinking about, other than, the disparate health outcomes, I hadn't been thinking about surveillance in the pandemic along racialized lines, but I had been thinking about them specifically along class lines, which of course those can never be disentangled. But my mother and I have very different positions. I am a person because of this job at the university that I can stay home, I can get things delivered. I have discretion in the amount of risk that I can take. Whereas my mom is really on the other side of things. She is a gig worker. She works for Instacart. And immediately when the pandemic first happened, we had this conversation about like, what does it mean? How can she stay home? Like we had to have this negotiation. Can I support you? How does this, because I didn't want her to leave. I didn't want her to leave the house, right? But this is how she feeds her children. And I was thinking about this week, again, going back to this idea of canvas surveillance, which we had, going on with the COLA strike before the ban, which was, interrupted by the pandemic. And I recognized something that happened to me, which is that for the past couple of weeks or so, I think it's been about 2 weeks, I've been pretty ill. And of course, anytime you feel ill, it's like, oh, do I have COVID? And I think, going back to Neda's point about like who has historically been surveilled and who has not, I found myself realizing for the first time that, I went and got tested and I didn't have COVID, but I was sort of waiting. I kept showing up to classes and I kept showing up to all of my meetings. I didn't bail on anything, even though a year ago, if I felt as bad as I did, I would have said, no, I'm sick. But because of the conditions of the pandemic, part of it being COVID, the sense that the only sickness I can have that's justified is COVID, right? That was the first part that I realized. I came to this realization that's what I was feeling. But the second part of that was about obligations around my labor. Can I not go to class or not go to that meeting? Because everything is on Zoom and I use my university Zoom account, I'm so highly aware of like surveillance. I think about, well, who are people tracking when I have my classes? I just recognize that that's something that factors into my decisions. And so this idea that I have in my mind, like, well, if I don't have COVID, is it okay for me not to show up in these different ways? And of course, part of it is that now that everything is online, you're always expected to show up because like, there's no barrier. It's not that you're out of town. It's not that you're, and so I think just that the subtlety of that constant surveillance and the expectation has really changed like my own relationship to labor and makes it so much more similar when I think about how, my mom's working for Instacart for years, or I think about, Amazon workers who, warehouse workers who can't take bathroom breaks. And so they've always been aware of this idea of like, am I on the clock? What can I eke out in terms of rest or care? Do I need to show up to work sick because I'm not sick enough, right? Like, or I'm not. And like, this is something that, folks have already been thinking about, and suddenly I'm confronted with it from a relative position of like privilege. And I think that's something that is, even if we go into childcare, which I don't have to deal with, like, yeah, there is something that is shifting in ways that I think a lot of folks are confronting for the first time.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if you know that there's been an uproar at institutions where people are teaching in person about the fact that these very simple reporting systems have been set up for students to report faculty members who don't teach in person when they're supposed to be teaching in person. So it's not even about the fact that you're teaching on Zoom, it's that this entire, teaching has been tremendously private labor in many ways. And we've seen over the past year, this, I think, very rapid shift to, I think, awakening to the conditions of our labor in really, really different ways, and all the different ways in which it's possible to be tracked. And as you say, mostly people who have not had a history of grappling with surveillance in quite the same way. We haven't clocked in, right? But now we clock in on Zoom.
I also appreciate you pointing out the acceleration that we're all experiencing, that this is sort of being used to like accelerate. You don't need 20 minutes anymore to walk from one meeting to the next. You just go to the next meeting, and there's no more days on campus and off campus. Every day is on campus and on call. And so, and I appreciate, you know, how you articulated that, the sense of, well, now I could be tracked, right? Just because everything is on Zoom. And in a way, it goes back to that kind of choice coercion question that we were talking about earlier. It's almost like the Amazon wristband without the wristband in a way.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about even when you get, you know, your groceries delivered now, there's so much more fidelity than I think used to happen. Now I can see the car as it moves to my door in a way that I think that used to be obscured. And now I'm like, oh, that's also me when I log into Zoom or I log out or I use Canvas or I don't use Canvas. And I bring that up because in the spring, you know, when we had the Canvas towel bot that the institution had put on our, you know, for people who don't know, during the COLA strike, you know, some of us were doing different forms of activism. And so the administration had put into our digital systems, basically a link to a form where students could report on any faculty or TAs who were either TAs who weren't showing up, or faculty or TAs who weren't turning in grades, but even just if we were holding classes in alternative form or talking about the strike. And it was very invasive. And because of that, I said I would never use Canvas again. And the following quarter, I didn't. And it was very labor intensive to find all of these other alternative forms to hold class in, but I did it. And this was before a pandemic. And now suddenly the pandemic, the conditions of the pandemic, it's like untenable for me to figure out how to do all of that again. And so again, trying to opt out of the system, especially in this accelerated context, like I don't feel like I have a choice. It's not really an option.
Yeah, I mean, I think another way of saying this is all technology is surveillance technology, right? There's not some surveillance technology and not surveillance technology. It's all surveillance if it is used in that way because of the way in which it tracks. There's no evanescence. There's no, you know, walking, as you say, walking somewhere without that being recorded. So I think that's, you know, a consequence, acceleration and a consequence of pandemic life. This is a slightly different question, but maybe brings us back to some of our initial conversation about race and racialization, which is in what ways might the violent insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th exacerbate the problem of surveillance technology that purports to be in the service of public safety? And what happens when white supremacists become the object of surveillance technology? Is anything different? And what would you anticipate the consequences would be for communities of color of this ostensible surveillance of whiteness or radical whiteness?
That's such an interesting question. I remember when it happened. I mean, I was chatting with a friend, and you know, she was saying, you know, this is the end of all protests. Like it took forever to even, you know, do anything to actually like these people were like let in, basically, like they were just let in. And then after the fact, there were these kind of attempts to I guess, reverse engineer some kind of, you know, locating of these people. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's a strong sense that this incident might be used to actually increase policing of sort of more radical movements. I don't know, AM, what are your thoughts?
I really appreciate this question in part because I'm so conflicted. I feel such ambivalence and like it's not resolved. You know, I gleefully watched as like Twitter CSI came into play and said, here's a face, here's the person, let's find them. Like I was like, oh, this is wonderful. And yet I also recognize the problem, by the way, it wasn't just the sort of low-tech Twitter CSI investigators. It was, people saying I took these faces and I ran it through a face detection algorithm. So, it wasn't the state doing it. It wasn't a corporation. It was regular folks. I mean, it's the internet, so you never know. And I remember I also had a conversation with a friend about this. They were like, how do you feel about like facial recognition being used in this way? And all I could answer, and I don't think my answers really evolved since this conversation, like about a week ago, I was like, I feel the same way I feel about that as I do about the guillotine. Like, it's great when you got it, but watch your head, like protect your neck. Like, that's kind of how I feel. It's, yeah, I mean, I think that I feel, and again, I'm so conflicted about this because I recognize immediately how problematic this is, but I'm like, I think I feel a little bit safer when it is the community who's using this technology. And it has a sense, like, even though it's flawed and problematic, I'm not trying to advocate for like vigilantism, but I liked the fact that it was a community that was actually trying to practice a form of ethics. People who were doing this on Twitter were very adamant about not posting anything until the information was thoroughly vetted. And of course, it's like you're not. How do you have Twitter accountability? Like, you can't. But I also felt safer with that than with the police, right? Who also just let them in. So I definitely didn't, I think that the structure that we have in place is so deeply flawed and dangerous and harmful, and there are no limits around it, that I actually trust communities more with this. And I think that it's more likely that communities can be held accountable than the police, for example. And I saw a tweet, I think it was this morning, among all the stock saga, but I really enjoyed this. And I think it was a tweet where somebody had been convicted, and they'd been convicted, and through the filing, it showed like how the FBI had tracked them down. And I think it was through messages that they had sent, and I think they were private text messages or something along those lines. And then the Twitter commenter, whose name I do not recall, said, "Hey, y'all, do you think that the FBI just asked the community, the public, for information just because they didn't want to show their hand, that they actually know all of our stuff anyway, that they're actually already have all of our information? They know where all of us are at. They know everything that we're saying." And I was like, yeah. So that's my messy response to that.
I love what you just said about community, because, and I already talked about this, but I sometimes feel like very uneasy about like the positioning of privacy as the solution to surveillance, because privacy is so like individualized, atomized. It seems like such an impoverished sort of political response. And I think that what you're saying about community is so right. I recently had a conversation with my former PhD student, Erin McElroy, who now works at the AI Now Institute at NYU. And, during the pandemic, they designed this amazing tool that, could be thought of as a surveillance tool, but it's like called an evictor watch. So like marking and mapping and naming like landlords who have evicted people during the pandemic. And so I think that what you're saying about community, and not policing, there's something really important there. So I appreciate that.
And just as a follow-up to that, the artist Kyle Mcdonald made this really incredible project called I Spy. And I definitely recommend people check it out. We can drop the link in chat later, but basically you go to the website and it doesn't store anything. It only stores locally on your device and gets deleted. So like there's an eye toward like privacy and tracking data, which is wonderful. But you enable your camera, it takes a snapshot of your face, and then it goes through the ICE employees to see if there's anyone that looks like you that works for ICE. And I think that's a wonderful use when we talk about like who can use this technology and to what ends. I think that's a really brilliant project that's like thinking about, your privacy, thinking about how it's using and storing your data, being transparent about that, right? Which also increases your knowledge, and it's kind of like, tacitly educational well when you are transparent about what's happening. And I think using that technology in that way, again, toward like community ends where there's something really powerful about seeing your face and understanding that again, you could be someone who works and upholds this system. It's not just sort of the scary, terrifying people. It's folks who are like legal counsel. It's folks who are, have clerical jobs. Like, yeah. So I think it's who's using it and what are their ethics, and can we have a conversation about that?
It's also really interesting to think that presumably that means that ICE employees' faces are available as a data set, right? And so beginning to think about kind of where does transparency, that question of transparency and privacy, right? What is publicly available? Our salaries are publicly available. In certain ways, our faces can be pulled off the websites. So yeah, that's a really great example. I'm going to jump to a couple of the questions that have been coming in the Q&A, and we're happy to receive more as well. The first one is, the film did not appear, and many people in this conversation in the Q&A have pointed this out. The film did not appear to advocate against facial recognition, but instead that we should develop this technology with equity and inclusivity in mind. It seems inevitable that this will evolve, that it will become more inclusive. What are your thoughts on the types of solutions, regulatory and otherwise, we need to ensure protection of privacy, or whatever else it is I'm inserting that you might think should be protected? If not privacy, then what? And being mindful of issues of equity and inclusivity and access. Accessibility would be the other one that I would put in there.
Oh my gosh, I'm always worried about like regulation as a solution. But I think one baseline would be that you should be able to opt out, right? Like Sophia Noble talks about the right to be forgotten. It's like you should have the right to not be a part of these systems. And yet I also think about how you can opt out of sort of spam calls. You can opt out of like credit stuff, but it's like, it's so difficult to do that. Like, if you search your own name, you're probably part of the like online white pages with a dossier on you. And it's so hard to like, you have to go to like 2,000 individual companies to say, hi, please take away this information. And then your information will just get uploaded again. So it's like a continuous, like it's an impossible process. Except probably if you're wealthy, I bet there's some service that prevents you from ever getting on there in the first place, right? So we talk about that. But I think this idea of like knowing who holds your data is actually really important, and being notified, like even just that level of transparency, and in a way that's legible, right? Like I understand that if I signed a EULA once 5 years ago, that now like, who knows, like 100,000 different entities have my information. I think it needs to be more difficult to get access to your data, and not in a way that puts the impetus on the, on the subjects. Like we need more power in that area. I also do think that there should be transparency around who's building what, and we need to figure out of some form of accountability, right? Like one of the problems as presented in the film with like the way that we approach this technology is we act like there are no builders. We just say, well, somebody coded this once and now the machine is teaching itself and the machine does stuff. And like, who do you hold accountable? I mean, we see this with, Tesla's self-drive, or sorry, I want to make sure I'm not being libelous or slanderous here. But one of these self-driving algorithms, right, like has killed people, has killed, like unwitting, like pedestrians. It's like, well, what happens when all of that proliferates? Like who's going to be held responsible, right? When it's so widespread, is it going to be a company? Is it going to be the person who owns the car? Like there's never any sort of line where we say like, no, actually this is who, there's no accountability. And I don't know what that process looks like, but I think we need to seriously consider it. And I do think that if there was more transparency in terms of the architects of these systems, then, I said this to Neda the other day, like, right, when the most privileged people are subjected to the same conditions as the everyday person, that's when you get legislation. So when all these, data practitioners or tech savvy, like architects and engineers, like are the subject of surveillance and they can't opt out, when you have to sign your name to something and then, the people are allowed to use your information, right, to our own ends, then I think that that's when you're going to get some real change. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the conversation we were having yet again about whether or not the purveyors of social media should be responsible for what appears on those platforms. And I heard all these discussions about this as this recent problem and how do we think this recent problem? I'm like, dude, I wrote a book about how this was a problem in the 17th century, right? Whether seditious pamphlets, whether the printer of a seditious pamphlet or the little bookseller, and you would find not the printer, right? But the woman who was selling the little seditious pamphlet in the street could be picked up, but not the publisher, not the printer. So I think we've been going through these notions for a long time about whose rights are protected and who is able to evade the accountability that ought to go along with the right of property. So if we're going to say that everything's property, then there also has to be accountability structures on the other side of that.
I mean, we're looking at this with what's happening with the stock market right now.
Right
now.
Yeah. Neda, anything to add about inclusivity and any of these are there regulatory solutions? What does a regulatory solution look like? Is it always punitive?
No, I mean, I agree with everything that both of you said. I think that, you know, when what is always protected is the corporation and private interest and property in the first instance, regulation is not going to be the solution, right? And I think that, I mean, one of the things that Kulin Devora and I wrote about in Surrogate Humanity is this, you know, concept of technoliberalism, right? Which is that one of the ways that discourses of technological progress work and technological modernity work is through incorporation, right? So that that sort of inclusive logic is always, you know, is there. It's like, it's part of how the system works. And I think the other thing that I would add to is that connected to all of this also is the question of policing, right? Because that's what's like looming always in the background with the facial recognition software, which was what the question asked. And, you know, so there's like the convenience piece, and then there's obviously like the policing piece, where like reform and regulation there is also going to be limited, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I kept thinking in the British facial recognition portion of the film, you know, what if there was a penalty for getting it wrong? Right? What if we leave the whole system in place, except that we introduce a penalty for being wrong? Because there is no penalty for being wrong. And, you know, what would that do to the system if we put penalties where they are not at present? People might be a little bit more hesitant to use the systems. So we have a question that is once again in the educational sphere, and we're actually having a conference about this in May, so I'll just plug, keep an eye out for, today is Data Privacy Day, and then there's Data Science Day, which is celebrated in mid-May. No, it's celebrated whenever we say that we're celebrating it, but we're having a conference on the uses and abuses of data in higher education, particularly data for learning. And this question is on this topic of tracking. What do you think about systems that track college student attendance or location services that identify students who are not in their classes, that do so in the name of promoting student success, promoting more equitable outcomes for the institution? The research shows that attendance is an important factor for student success. Do you think this is ever in a student's best interest?
Sorry, I just, oh boy. It makes sense that, of course, attendance, you know, is correlated with success, but I don't think compulsory attendance, because you're being surveilled, is exactly the same. And I say this as someone who typically has very lax attendance policies in their classes, who often starts classes by saying, I only want you to be here if you're going to be here. I don't take any points off. I've done this with large scale lectures, and then guess what? The classes are all still full. The seats, the bodies are in the seats, as they say, right? And so I just, no, that's my answer, no.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, ultimately, you know, I too, I think in terms of, you know, relative to other colleagues, have very, very lax attendance policies. And, you know, ultimately, if somebody's forced to just show up because they are going to be tracked, I don't actually think that they're going to be learning that much anyway. I mean, I think there are many ways to be present, and there are also many ways to be absent. And so I think punitive policies and some kind of, you know, tracking device for college attendance is like the last thing I would want to see personally.
I really appreciate that you, because I was just the next thing I was thinking about, like, right, there's a difference between just being there and being present, and that's what you need to be present. But I'm also thinking about, we already know how this is going to play out. Like, if we think about, you know, policies that punish parents for truancy, right? The thing is, if you can't be in class, or you don't want to be in class, there are usually structural issues behind that. So this is going to punish students who are, you know, working a few jobs to make it through school. This is going to punish students who are having, you know, mental health issues or having family emergencies, ongoing, you know, structural issues that, you know, I mean, if the university wants to track students to be in you know, if the university wanted to increase attendance because they think increasing attendance, you know, increases student success, then I would say maybe don't spend the money on the tracking and maybe put those resources into the other forms of support that make students feel, one, that they have a community, make students want to show up to class, maybe, you know, alleviate some of those pressures, maybe not showing up to class because you feel the pressures of being a first generation student who has to study engineering instead of art. Like maybe we like start tackling those sorts of things instead of just saying, well, are you in the room, and not caring about what your experience is in that room, right? That's, yeah.
You know what,
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
so right. That is so right. What about lowering tuition? What about providing housing? And I mean, if we look at, you know, the pandemic has, there have been some astounding figures about school districts, and now I'm talking K through 12, where sometimes absence rates are like in the 80%, right? And so we have the data now about like resources and attendance. So what about investing in resources rather than in, you know, private companies and developers developing technologies that are, you know, just as, you know, the book Automating Inequality puts it, automating inequality.
yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, just to put this out there, is that I've never seen one of these systems that's used punitively, and I would not endorse bringing one of these systems in. The point is, these systems are widespread at other institutions, generally put into place by the champions of first generation students, and they're called nudging systems. So they're not punitive. The idea is it's an early warning system for a student who might have a pattern that's strongly associated with failing a class that they need in order to stay on track in their academic programs. So they're not as malign as we're sort of making them to be, which I'm not saying means they're benevolent, but it's pretty widespread that these systems of these early warning systems, as they're called, of which tracking where students are at a particular moment in time, or saying, you didn't come to class today, is everything okay? Right? I just wanted to check in with you and find out if you were okay, which actually I've seen during the pandemic, a lot of writing by people who are passionate advocates of minoritized students, calling for lots of reaching out, and I see that you haven't been coming to class. And so it's interesting to think about where tracking shades benevolent and where tracking shades malevolent.
Jody, I wanted to ask, does the system nudge the student directly? And is that a human being? Is it an automated sort of like friendly AI, like when I'm trying to set up a doctor's appointment? Because I do think that what you're talking about is an automated version of something that I already do as an educator, which is communicate out to, if I have TAs or if it's a class I'm teaching myself, seeing where students are at, and then not nudging them, or well, maybe it's a nudge, I don't know, but saying, hey, is everything okay? I noticed that you weren't here, or I noticed that your participation, like, how can I support you? Right? Like that is a practice that I fully endorse, but I also don't know that I want it to be automated. Like, I think I want to be able to check in. So maybe if the system nudged me and made my labor a little bit easier, that I could be okay with.
Yeah.
But again, yeah.
Oh, they run the gamut. I mean, to answer your question, AM, they run the gamut. This conversation runs the gamut from just using your attendance records or using your the big one right now in online education is, looking at Canvas analytics to see it's been 2 weeks since little Bobby checked in to anything related to this class. Now, that's one person's deep state surveillance and another person's compassionate pedagogy. So yeah, I think it takes us kind of into the heart of what we're talking about, and no easy answers. And I agree with you. I mean, I have always kept a lot of records on my students and reached out to them when they're not, necessarily around as much as I would like to see them. But I think that is quite different from the idea that, we're sort of ankle tracking our students. At a lot of institutions, they use this is where it starts to get super creepy. They use the campus Wi-Fi network. Most campuses use the campus Wi-Fi network to find out things like what are high density areas of campus at a particular time. Do we have enough services in those areas of campus? But you can see how quickly that slides into a system of tracking and surveillance.
And I think it always comes back to, what we've been talking about, can you opt out? And are there any penalties for that, right? Like I've been thinking about when we were talking about corporate surveillance. And I think Neda and I, we might've talked about these like wellness programs now that so many, right? Like institutions are implementing where it's like, yeah, we just want you to be healthy and feel good. Like sideline, no, we want to lower our costs because we pay for your healthcare. But also if you don't like enroll in the yoga app, then you need to pay these like premiums, right? So then I always wonder like, sure, like, again, these are tools, we should be able to use them, but we should also have a choice to say, no, actually, I don't want my data collected. In the same way that Apple always asks me if I want to send crash reports to improve their system. I want their system to be good because I really like my phone, but no, I don't want to send you the crash reports, sorry.
Yeah, and of course, so much of what you're pointing out, AM, is about the way in which, as everyone has been saying again during the pandemic, our life is so organized through our employers in this country, right? I mean, presumably there are other ways to ensure that your citizens are in good health than to penalize them for not using the yoga app at work, right? So that's a whole other level of this conversation. So I'm going to move to a question that we talked about before the event. And instead of using our version of this question, I'm going to use a question that came in from one of the audience members. But I think this would be a great way to spend our last moments together is what might a digital data or AI utopia look like? What rule, if there could be such a thing, what rules or policies would a governing body have to regulate it? Or would it be a kind of data anarchism? Would algorithms still be property? And if not, what kind of an entity would they be?
We talked about this before. That sounds like a really big, complicated question. I'm like, wait, did I have an answer for that on deck?
Well, it was more the question about, according to this film, let me give you the other version of it. According to this film, the machine was simply replicating the world as it is, or even as it has been. Could it be otherwise? Can you imagine these capacities being harnessed for something other than obedience training? As the film puts it, right? Like, what good can data do, I guess?
Yeah, I want to give you the kind of jokey answer or the cynical, dark answer. Maybe I'll start there and maybe it'll generate something else in me. I'm a little tired after a full day of back-to-back surveilled meetings. I'm just thinking about the structure of our society. One of the impacts is that it limits our imagination. Like it's really hard to imagine a society that's completely transformed and restructured in ways that, like, I feel like the first grab is like, yeah, well, maybe we regulate the bad system. Maybe we, you know, like we opt out. Maybe somebody can give me a big, you know, 80-page terms of service that tells me all the ways on which they're like screwing me over that I definitely don't, at least in online, well, all cultures, online culture. I'm like, you know, I teach these classes that are like game design, but IRL. And they're meant to be like played in person or developed in person. And then I started my career like, oh, everything's IRL. Like the internet is IRL, like this is where we're living our lives. And so, you know, I guess something that I've expressed this to friends, you know, I was really worried when a new administration came in that was just less chaotic than the Trump administration, because I thought, well, people are just going to kind of relax because we're all so traumatized and just so tired. You know, it's like a lot to whatever side you're on. You know, it's a lot just to process daily and weekly. I don't think I've never been so engaged politically, like every single day, like what is the president doing? And so I think I was afraid that people would just be like, oh, sigh of relief. Now we can kind of take a breather. But actually what I'm seeing is that like so many of us are just online, like this is where this discourse is happening and people are coming up. What's happening with the stock market is like, you know, we've had these calls for unity over the past, 2 weeks now. And I'm like, wow, strange that like this call for unity with people who have politics that I'm sure find repugnant, some of them are all banding together to try to, you know, manipulate and influence the markets in the ways that like wealthy, powerful people have been doing historically. And I think that, you know, something that maybe came out of this moment that surprised me is I don't think that people are relaxed. I think that the hypervigilance that came about from the Trump administration, and particularly Trump as a singular figure who was always online and present, I think that hypervigilance and energy, that desire to check the news, and now there is no, right? It's not the same. You don't get that hit of chaos. That energy is going to go somewhere. And we saw part of that was, right, the Capitol riots. But I think also part of that is people just saying, no, we want something to happen. And if we've got to, you know, band together and figure out what that is and experiment. And like, I feel like this nation feels awake. Like people are paying attention and they are activated. And I think like that actually gives me a lot of hope for what our future looks like, that suddenly, you know, masses of people are learning tacitly like how financial markets work and don't work and who they work for, even if they didn't sort of have the political or academic scholarly context to understand these things before, or to engage with them if they didn't have certain communities or access to certain forms of knowledge. So I do feel really hopeful about the future in that sense.
Beautiful, Neda.
You know, AM, I really love what you said about starting to think about that question of what can be different from the point of thinking about the ways in which our imaginations are limited. You know, and I think about the very start of the film Coded Bias, and the whole film starts with Joy being in what is it called, like a speculative fabulations class, right? And so it's this class that's supposed to actually allow you to design and program something in a way that doesn't have to be practical, that doesn't have to be about efficiency or producing value or producing profit, right? And so I think that that, you know, how we think about how to expand our imaginations is really key. And you know, and then even there in that speculative fabulations class, she comes across a problem that demonstrates how particular racial histories have limited the tools that are available. You know, I even think about that moment in the film where she talks about what inspired her to think about going to MIT, and it's this robot Kismet. Well, having done some research on that robot Kismet, the roboticist who designed Kismet based the emotional drives. Kismet is the cute little robot, and it's supposed to show to the person they're interacting with, whether it's happy or sad or angry. And these emotional drives were based on Darwin's writings. And those writings were all about how, you know, people of color and people in Africa and indigenous people they displayed their emotions in like a much baser way than Europeans. So it's so interesting to think about, you know, the imagination and what gets the imagination going, and then coming across limitations. But there, you know, Kismet is a robot that's supposed to interact with other people. And so that gets me back, Am, to what you said about the collective. So I wonder if it's about designing technologies and programs that are about enacting a different kind of social relation than the ones that we're so used to. Where we desire the personal assistant that's feminized, like Siri or Alexa, right? Or where we desire a kind of servitude from technology, a servitude that may or may not, you know, turn us into property. But what are kind of design or engineering practices that can, you know, think about producing a different kind of social relation? And that I do think is, as you said so beautifully, Am, like a collective project.
And a speculative project. And I think it really brings us back to where we began. You know, the point is made repeatedly in the film that so many of these technologies, which purport to be future looking or predictive, are actually historical. They're always looking back. They're always drawing on prior information. And I think, you know, what both of you have just said so beautifully, and what a wonderful place to end is, you know, really speculation is the antidote to tracking. And speculative activity, fiction making, collective fiction making, social fiction making, whatever that would be, is the beginning of an answer to this question: what would an alternative way of using these tools really look like? And what, you know, what kind of house can you build with these tools if you're not building yet another prison? So with that, thank you so much, both of you, for bringing so much insight and so much wisdom to this film, but also just to this topic in general. And thank you so much to those of you who post questions, and to the offices, data privacy and university relations, that made this event possible. So everybody have a great night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists, for such an insightful and invigorating conversation. We're going to send an email with a link to the recording, everybody, to follow up. Thanks again.
Thanks for moderating, Jody, and thanks to everyone for setting this up.